Welcome to Theory and Practice, a podcast dedicated to decoding research in the field of speech-language pathology.
We dive deep into the latest evidence-based practices, demystify and complex studies, and provide practical insights for implementing research findings in your everyday therapy sessions. My name is Sarah, a school-based SLP with a passion for intervention strategies, and
I am John. I am a doctoral student specializing in AAC and research implementation. Join us as we unpack evidence-based practices and empower you to provide the highest quality care for your clients.
As a disclaimer, this is just our personal opinions and thoughts. It is not meant to misinform or claim the intentions of the literature or publications. We also encourage you to read and interpret the findings independently.
All right. So, how are you, Sarah?
I am doing well. I'm really excited about this article. I know the beginning half is always so super sounding professional, but we're just not that professional.
I know. We're all humans in the end. But I do want to talk about this very interesting article. I think it's also a lot of SLPs are really talking about this as well. And you can also see that in social medias, and you also see it in, Instagram reels, and, bits and pieces of how to be a better clinician in this regard. And the topic that I want to share with you today is on neurodiversity. Okay, so Sarah, I'm assuming you have heard about this term before.
Definitely. I'm seeing more and more of it more on social media, and I'm seeing a lot more people considering themselves as neurodiversity affirming. And I guess my question, just before we get into the research, is really just understanding what that means, because this is so new to me, the idea of what neurodiversity is. Because this is not something that was taught to me in grad school. It really is so new. I don't even feel like I really heard about neurodiversity until at least 2019, like during the COVID lockdown.
Right. You're absolutely right in terms of that. So today, let's go ahead and unpack this article that I shared and found with you. And for the listening audience, I will be happy to reference this article so you guys can look it up as well. So this is actually from the ASHA Perspectives article, the ASHA Perspectives Journal. This article is specifically a tutorial, meaning that this is not a research article. This is not an empirical finding. This is specifically meant to tutor or to inform clinicians how to implement neurodiversity affirming practices. So the title is called A Primer on Neurodiversity Affirming Speech and Language Services for Autistic Individuals, written by Gaddy and Crow. And it was recently published in August of 2023. So I'll be happy to unpack this article with you.
Yeah, I actually have a question just to rewind back to what you just said, that this is not a scientific art research article, that this is more of a tutorial. So tutorials, by definition of what you're saying, is it's just to inform.
Correct. So if they're trying to if they are trying to show a new therapeutic strategy or a therapeutic assessment tools, it'll be considered as a tutorial just to tell SLPs how to implement this rather than a research findings. However, the findings are to build their argument or to build this practice, they do bring in research, but it's not a particular research study.
Because it doesn't have because it's not empirical, because it doesn't have it's not quantifiable.
It's more so in a way to bring clinicians a new perspective on how to enhance their practice or change their practice or modify their practice. It's more of a, think of it like a think tank in a sense.
Oh, it's an idea.
Correct.
An idea. Okay. That's really cool. Okay.
So
let's get to it.
Sure. Aim of this tutorial has 3 different tenets to define what neurodiversity is. How does that play in as evidence-based practice or culturally responsive care, and what does that look like in the therapy practices? So they bring in authors from all over, outside of ASHA, I would definitely would say, right? Autistic scholars, scholars who identify themselves as autistics. Or we're also going to bring in philosophers. We're also going to be bringing in current authors like Tiffany Hammond, like A Day with No Words, and things like that, to really look into what really neurodiversity affirming practices really look like here in this sense. So the goal of this primer is to integrate neurodiversity affirming care principles into their practice. So this journal article is more of how to teach clinicians to do neurodiversity affirming care in their speech and language sessions. Why don't we just go ahead and just define what neurodiversity is, and then just walk through the author's perspectives and the thoughts, and then the things that we find that maybe are controversial to what autistic scholars are finding, or some of our scholarly works outside of ASHA are providing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what often happens when I'm reading research is that they're always cross-referencing, right? They're always cross-referencing to other things. And truly, I'm not going to understand fully the intentions of those outside sources unless I've read those outside sources, right?
Right.
I think what's very notable here to me is that they're defining neurodiversity as defined by Jim Sinclair, who was an autistic activist who had wrote the essay Don't Mourn for Us in 1993. And I cannot, first of all, I am 1993 and we're talking about this in 2023. That's a long time that we are now uncovering that. And I just am very curious to learn more about this essay. And I'm curious to also understand, how did this now just become such a big movement when it had been published so long ago?
Mm-hmm. So I think that this type of conversation wasn't really the type of conversation that was happening in the autism community or within the disability community. And I think the authors even wrote in this conversation really blew up in the early 2000s, where there was the rise of the website and the internet, and there was lots of, accessibility to information, and building online long distance communities all around the world, that this conversation is now happening. And I'm assuming some of these articles, 1993, 1980 something, they were only existing within the academic realm, or you physically have to go to a library to search for them. So the accessibility level is now is now changed, right? It's more accessible. You're able to find more information and so forth.
That's really interesting, because in our last podcast, we kind of discussed about evidence-based practice for school-based SLPs.
Yes.
Though research is now more accessible with the advent of the internet, only really have access to ASHA journals, right?
True.
So, John, I know that you've read Don't Mourn for Us. It's not just only Don't Mourn for Us, but also the term neurodiversity was also coined by Judy Singer from 1999 as well.
Yes.
These are all people, I have no idea who they are. No, I've never heard of them in grad school, and nobody's ever talked to me about them. Even in the neurodiversity movement, I don't think I heard their name before, or I may have overlooked that, right? And so I would love to hear more about those two pieces.
Sure. So I'm going to be honest, Sarah, I have not heard of these people until I got into my doctoral program. So I was in the same boat exactly as you until I started my doctoral studies. And so Judy Singer in 1999 wrote this manifesto back in the day. Okay. she's an Australian scholar, right? Wrote this piece on neurodiversity. And I think this is her dissertation work. I really proposed the idea, saying that neurodiversity is a neurological difference, and it's natural and a value part of human diversity. So they're saying that autism in itself is a neurological condition. But when we're taking that neurological condition, it's considered as a neurological diversity that we find in ourselves as well. So really change that conversation from autism as a deficit to autism as a diverse form of who we are.
Okay, so time out just for a second because you said something really wild to me. Okay, so when we talk about so Singer is saying that it's a part neurodiversity is a part of our natural being.
So here's the thing. I think the authors really mapped out how this conversation really happened, right? So if we go back to page 2, defining neurodiversity section, right? Sinclair, 1993, really starts the conversation off by saying, do not mourn for us. Let's unpack. So I had the privilege to read this piece for my doctoral level class. And really, it struck me to the core and be like, what am I doing as a clinician, right? So according to Jim Sinclair, right, in 1993, he states that autism isn't something a person has or a shell that a person is trapped inside. There is no normal child hidden behind the autism. Autism is a way of being. It is pervasive. It colors every experience, every sensation, perception, thought, emotion, and encounter every aspects of existence. It is not possible to separate the autism from the person. And if it were possible, the person you'd had left would not be the same person you started with. So, and the author goes on and this is a really striking point where it kind of struck me to the core, where he says, therefore, when parents say, I wish my child did not have autism, what they're really saying is, I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, and I had a different non-autistic child instead. When you mourn for our existence, this is what we hear. When you pray for a cure, this is what we hear, right? When you tell your fondest hopes and dreams for us, that your greatest wish is that one day we will cease to be, and strangers you can love will move in behind our faces. That is what kind of kicked the conversation off back in 1993, when parents are mourning about their child with when they hear the autism diagnosis. They're saying that you are rejecting me as a child, as their child.
Wow. I guess when we think about neurodiversity, is it also saying that like many of us are also autistic? Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, because it's sounding like, based on what you're saying from these two authors, that it's just, it's just it's not just one person classified as autistic. Like maybe many of us are autistic as well. Am I misunderstanding, John?
No, you're absolutely right on that sense. So I think back in the day, Jim Sinclair didn't have the term to understand this concept, but he did really well, or the author in this case, because I don't know their pronouns, the author did a really great job of really explaining what is going on with the intention of my child has a disability and I am mourning. And I think that was in 1993. And then in 1999, I'm just mapping out the historical definitions here. 1999, we have Judy Singer. Judy Singer coined the term neurodiversity, right? So it is an idea that neurological difference are a natural and valuable part of human diversity, akin to differences in race, gender, and sexual orientation. Saying that it is not a disability, it's a difference, basically. And we talk about this all the time when we work with kids who speak languages other than English. Is it a language disorder or is it a language difference? Now let's change that to autism. Is that a disability or is that a disorder or a difference? Right?
Yeah.
So that's where that whole idea kind of like put in conversation between Sinclair and Singer, right? And then in 1998, so now we're moving a little bit further, 1998, Bloom further expanded the concept of neurodiversity They're saying it is a neurological difference, should be viewed as a natural variation. So again, this neurological condition or a difference is a natural variation of who we are. So basically they're saying, Sarah, what you prefer and what I prefer are different, and that's okay. Same thing with other students who are autistic themselves. They process the world differently, and that's okay,
Mhm.
right? And then in 2010, actually, in 2010, they have who is this author? I cannot say this author's name. So sorry to the author who may be listening to this. Sasumasu in 2010 really coined the term again from neurodiversity to a neurodivergent. Neurodivergent is now really aiming towards the individual. I am a neurodivergent.
Mhm.
Right? So when she wrote the blog post, the meaning of neurodivergent in 2010 is used to refer to those who think, act, and communicate in ways that diverge significantly from a dominant cultural standards from normal behavior. Now, this author really has took it all the way home and saying, you are a neurodivergent.
Okay.
So it came from this philosophical idea of how parents are thinking about disability, moving toward the discussion towards is it a disability or a difference, right? And then taking us home to you are a neurodivergent.
Okay. I mean, that was a lot of information at one time. I'm just processing that information right now. But Jim Sinclair, like, don't mourn for us. I mean, that sounds like a manifesto as well, like for every clinician to read. Especially because you want to be centering the voices of autistic people, you want to center the voices of AAC users. And I think the authors here for this article in particular that we're reading about also discusses this model of, I forgot what it was called, but it was like nothing about us without us.
Yes, 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 yes.
I love that. I love that idea. Like nothing about us without us. And then we're always centering the people first and from their lived experiences.
Correct, correct. So nothing about us without us was also part of that disability movement back in 1998. This is where all this like type of movement happened co-occurrently, I would say. So we have the neurodiversity movement, and then we also have like the disability movement. They were happening at the same time, if you really think about it back in the day. And they really challenged the medical model and then the social model. And then they said, nothing about us without us is saying that don't talk about me without me. Don't talk about my disability without me.
That's interesting too, also is, and I guess I just would like to hear your thoughts on this is like the term even disability.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is also like before this kind of movement of like, I shouldn't even call it a movement, right? Because it's been going on for so long that I kind of look at it as more like before this was unearthed by so many advocates and activists, right? Even the term disability could have felt insulting especially to some parents. Like if we said like, oh, this child has a disability, like they would feel very offended by that. It's like, no, this child has many abilities, right?
Or
like
different abilities.
different abilities, right?
Yeah.
Like there's so many like
Yeah.
play off and almost feeling like disability is such a taboo word, right? And I'm just wondering how that also falls in line with neurodiversity.
So I think we have to go back to centering the person. What you said, Sarah, is like that neurodiversity or being a neurodivergent is being that specific individual that you are, and that's okay. That's what neurodiversity is also saying. And simultaneously, we also have the disability movement that was happening where they're really challenging the medical model. Some of them, according to the authors that we're reading right now, even said the disability rights movement central ideology relies on the social model of disability, saying that a person is disabled because of the societal barriers. So
Mm.
lack of accommodation, lack of modification, and discrimination rather than inherent deficits. So instead of me, the society is disabling me. There is a there is another literature I would like to share with you, maybe sometime in the another episode, about how school settings are disabling the child.
Mm.
That's another radical thought too, is that the society is disabling me as an individual. So for example, like when we have to stay in line, what if I can't, handle that being in line for too long? Or what if I have to what are some of the things that are kind of like cultural norms? When the teacher is talking, we have to stay silent and seated, you know? Can't we have the position to stand up and stretch while the lecture is happening? These hidden curriculums, social hidden curriculums and things like that, those are all societal barriers that are disabling me, making me look like I have a disability. Right.
That's also really interesting because it also kind of because I do AAC, right? Like it also falls in line with that idea of like universal design too, right?
Yes, yes.
It's so when we're looking at even environmental like access methods, they're so limited for people who have physical disabilities, right? Who can, like, you need wheelchair ramps. And although we do have laws now that requires more accessible ramps and bathrooms and all of that, but I think it's the Rehabilitation Act, I believe that's what it was. The Rehabilitation Act allows all that, but there's still so many barriers to that. It might be like the ramp might be in like the back door. It's like the back of the restaurant or something like that.
Exactly.
It's a little meaning that everybody else who are able-bodied can walk through the front, and then now the people who need wheelchairs and access methods needs to go towards the back, right?
Right.
And so it kind of falls in line with the idea that like society is not welcoming us, and society creates this disability because we are not the majority. Because had everyone needed all of these accommodations, would this even be considered a disability?
Exactly. If we created ramps for everybody to use to enter a building, right? If we created some sort of accessibility method that can be used by everyone, then do we even see a disability at this point?
Yeah.
Maybe not. So yeah.
True inclusion as well, right? And also these accommodations that we're talking about. I mean, when I see some of the accommodations, it's like it'll be something like extended time. It'll be like double time, repeat directions or something.
Right.
Or like taking breaks, frequent breaks, right? But if a teacher was building that into their day, that wouldn't even be necessary as an accommodation, right? Because it's already in my program.
It's already embedded in the curriculum.
Right. Yes, universal design learning, right? So that all would be part of tier 1. And so I just really feel like that is the ideas of inclusion is so limited for us in our society.
Yes, and I think I definitely agree with you. Some, are not bought into that idea, right? So there's also that attitudinal barriers, societal barriers, physical barriers, things like that. So there's multiple types of barriers that we're facing when we're thinking about inclusion and the social model of disability. It's not me, it's the society that's disabling me. Right? So they say, like, if you go to another country and that country is only, speaking a certain language that you don't speak, you have a communication disorder right there. I mean, temporarily when you're in there, it's a society that's disabling you.
And also it just also falls on like I really love what you're saying right now, that also like cultural differences can like just because America feels like eye contact is so important, right? That like
Yes,
that's part
yes.
of like being like that is not the case. Like it's a very Western idea, right? Like that is not the case. Like where my family is from,
Correct,
Asia,
correct.
right? Like
Hmm.
it's like you would not look at an adult in
You
their
won't be.
eyes.
You should not be.
So there is something to say about like what is a disability based on culture, right? And how
Yes,
do we
yes.
define autism is also another question.
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
does
Hmm.
and it's again because I'm so ignorant, right? Like I only know what's happening in America. But if I were to go to other parts of the world, do they define autism the same way as DSM-5? If they do, my question is like, is that just westernizing those parts of the world versus it being like intrinsically they believe that that's what the standard of autism is, right?
That's a really great question, Sarah. I think the author is making that second point as you're moving the conversation along, is that neurodivergent affirming care is culturally responsive and evidence-based practice. So I think the author brings up the ASHA what would they say? The ASHA guidelines of what evidence-based practice is. And let's talk about that because ASHA describes it as a pyramid or a triangle. And those three sides of those triangles are very interesting, where you have your clinical expertise, that's one of them. And then you also have your clients or their families or their stakeholders. And then the third one would be considered the scientific evidence, right? So the empirical findings. We did this randomized control trial. This is what we found. But ASHA is actually saying that that is one piece of evidence-based practice. And the other pieces are your own clinical decision making from working with that family. And another piece would be, what do the families want? What do the families desire? What do the families want from the clinician or want this to look like? So triangulating all of those three components are what considered evidence-based. So we have so ASHA kind of posits this client-centered care is an essential component of evidence-based practice because we need to take in the clients and families' perspective into our clinical practice here, right? And forefront of the decision making and the priorities, such as their unique needs and professions, it involves actively incorporating the client in their own care, acknowledging them as an expert of their own experiences. So now we're instead of saying how many words this child can produce, now I'm hearing a lot of qualitative data coming in, their experiences, perceptions, and fostering a collaborative partnership between clients and their service providers. And by doing so, you are delving into cultural contexts and perspectives of people we serve. So if you're already serving a family member who speaks languages other than English, and you also they self-identify themselves as neurodivergent, you're already doing culturally centered care by having them be a part of the clinical decision making.
That's a really interesting point because I do see so much overlap in culturally responsive care and
Mhm.
where this article was moving towards. I serve a lot of multilingual families, right? And how am I honoring their home language? Like all of that requires so much collaboration.
Mhm.
So really, instead of looking at EVP like triangle, I almost look at it as like circle. Okay. Where
Mm.
in the middle is the AAC I'm not AAC, but the client family. That's central. And all the intervention, EBP, like that, not EBP, like the research needs to stem from what they believe, what they want, right? But I also feel like I have found, again, like this is just from my own experience. This doesn't mean that this is happening everywhere, right? But
Mhm.
some families do not believe in neurodiversity, right? And we see this in any form of cultural movement, right? So prior to bilingualism being like honored, right? There used to be like, you had to choose one language, right? Prior to, so even gender affirming, right? Like using different pronouns, like this is not, there's always some resistance that may also come because our society has not caught up, right? And so I am meeting a lot of families who are also just like, I want just what Jim Sinclair is saying. Like, I want them to be like, quote unquote, like normal, neurotypical. They want them to fit within the given societal norms.
Right,
So
right.
sometimes the intervention, because the family is in the center, I'm seeing this conflict where I'm like, I don't really, in a clinical, for my own clinical judgment, feel like this is ethical practice for me. But what happens when a family is just not there yet, right? In accepting the diagnosis,
Right, right.
especially
So
little ones, right?
especially little ones, right? So I don't know if you read about this poem, Welcome to Holland. Have you heard of that poem
Not at
before?
all.
So
I only
let's
read Asha, John.
So you know what? Let's I do want to introduce that poem called Welcome to Holland. So basically, this poem is talking about the perspective of a parent who's expecting a child, right? And if you read about that poem, I'll just read an excerpt to you. It's by Emily Pearl Kingsley. It published in 1987. Kind of fits that whole disability neurodiversity movement, the emergence. And the author starts off by saying this: I am often asked to describe the experience of raising a child with a disability, try to help people who have not shared that unique experience to understand it, to imagine how it would feel like. It's like this: when you're going to have a baby, it's like planning a fabulous vacation trip to Italy. You buy a bunch of guidebooks and make wonderful plans, the Colosseum, Michelangelo David, the gondolas in Venice. You may learn some handy phrases in Italian. It's all very exciting. After months of eager anticipation and the day finally arrives, you pack your bags and off you go. Several hours later, the plane lands. The flight attendant comes and says, Welcome to Holland. Holland, you say? What do you mean, Holland? I signed up for Italy. I'm supposed to be in Italy. All my life I've dreamed of going to Italy. But there's been a change in the flight plan. They've landed in Holland, and there you must stay. The important thing is that they haven't taken you to a horrible, disgusting, filthy place full of pestilence, famine, and disease. It's just a different place. So you must go out and buy new guidebooks, must learn a new language, and you will meet a whole new group of people you would never have met. It's just a different place. It's slower paced than Italy, less flashy than Italy. But after you've been there for a while and you catch your breath, you look around and you begin to notice that Holland has windmills and Holland has tulips. Holland even has Rembrandts. But everyone you know is busy coming and going from Italy. They're all bragging about what a wonderful time they had there. And for the rest of their life, you will say, yes, that's where I was supposed to go. That's what I had planned. And the pain of that will never, ever, ever go away because the loss of that dream is a very significant loss. But if you spend your life mourning the fact that you didn't go to Italy, you may never be free to enjoy the very special, the very lovely things about Holland.
That was beautiful. That's beautiful. And I think this is important because I think that we're not doing enough of that type of reading. We're not reading from the perspectives of like parents, perspectives from like, autistic individuals, right? We're not doing enough work there. And also like if I knew this where to guide my parents, right? If they're experiencing this, like, I don't even feel like there's resources for me to even recommend.
So I think it's like this. I think Asha has been very focused on clinical practice, which is very important, but we've just perseverated. I'm using this ableist term, please forgive me, but we're kind of perseverating in that realm and really haven't reached out to other sources of materials such as disability studies or or other forms of literature that are out there.
Mhm.
But for me, when I read this poem and when I compare Don't Mourn for Me, I have a sense of that parent still wishing to go to Italy, right? Wishing that that I would have, what would my life be if I'm at Italy? But according to Jim is it right? Jim
Sinclair.
Sinclair, he's saying that you wishing to go to Italy is rejecting my presence.
Mhm. It's powerful.
So it's very controversial. I feel like the perspectives are so different depending on who you're going to, even back in the day.
So this, yeah, I mean, just to, I'm still again processing this great material, right? Because it's very new to me, and seeing these perspective pieces from actual families and parents and just the actual individual themselves, like being the core and moving this movement is really,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the ideal for me, right? I would love it for it to be coming from their centering the actual voices of, autistic people. And,
Mm-hmm.
so that's an ideal situation for me. But I do have to mention, and in the article, the original article that we are discussing, what is it,
Yes.
Crow?
Gaddy and Crow,
Gaddy
yes.
and Crow.
Mm-hmm.
They say this, and it was such a punch in the face too for me. It was like, we cannot be neuroaffirming without respecting intersectionality.
Yes.
We
Yes.
cannot be
Yes.
neuroaffirming without also being anti-racist.
Mm-hmm.
Ableism, including neurobigotry, is inextricably linked to eugenics.
Mm.
Ableism, racism, colonialism are intersecting forms of oppression that are often used as means for exclusion, particularly in special education.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that is so powerful because when you do look at the systems of oppression, we can look at it from a space of racism. We can look at it as a space of colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
And those frameworks also do apply to the disability culture, like the disability world, right? Like it is a form of, we're oppressing them. It's oppression when we're doing this.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
that intersection, like the way that they had written, that was like so true. And she goes on, when we do not recognize intersectionality, we erase aspects of a person's identity and uphold harmful ideas. In addition, failing to recognize intersectionality is failing to recognize reality. Racially and ethnically minoritized individuals with disabilities face greater and different socioeconomic, school discipline, and special education disparities than those who are white.
White. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
like that is so true. We know about the school to prison pipeline, right? We know about these systemic ways of oppression. And then now you have a disability. It's just like another kind of intersection. And basically, only the privileged will come up out of it.
Exactly. So to add to that conversation, there is one piece that I want to introduce called the Neuroqueer Heresies. This author really talked about the idea of the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So have you heard of this piece before?
No,
The
but
master's
I love the
tools.
title, The Master's Tools. I like it.
It is in the book called The Neuroqueer Heresy when they talk about neurodiversity as its own identity in itself. And there's a section called The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. So think about Asha. Asha is the almighty thing that we all follow. If we follow what Asha says, we can never dismantle Asha. That's what they're saying. So I
love how you used Asha as an example. I'm like, they are an oppressive system for me, but okay.
I mean, to make it relevant to our listeners here who are SLPs, right? True. I mean, in order to maintain our Cs, we have to pay our dues. Right. And if we're abiding to that master's tools, then we're just perpetuating the system. So this was actually from a poem called the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, from a feminist author, Audre Lorde, and saying that for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. So if we really want to change how we do things here at ASHA, when we can publish things like the tutorial here as a temporary thing, but to dismantle and rebuild that is something different, that is not going to happen. We have to go one step further about that, in terms of moving away from oppression.
Well, what is
I
that?
don't know if I'm making any sense.
No, I'm following.
Yeah.
But I feel, what is the next step then? Is that?
So this is something that I don't have an answer to, because we don't know if intersectionality is something that is, that can be, if we don't recognize intersectionality, right? If we don't recognize disability, race, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, right? The language is spoken, then we are, what you said, we are oppressing them, and we are reinforcing the master's tools, comparing to what ASHA would, how ASHA would proceed. And what is the next step? We don't know. I don't know. Do you know?
Well, it sounds like, based on what you've just read. So again, I've never read this. So this is like my first time. So, and it's also auditory, right? Like, you just read it to me. So I just have retaining from my auditory memory, right?
I have the literature up. I'm just reading from it.
There's no visual for me here, but from what it sounds like to me, it sounds like you cannot just work from within the system. You need to break the system.
Exactly.
Right. And so if your master, quote unquote, were to be ASHA, but it may not be, right? But if it were to be ASHA, then it would be just discontinuing, participating in their methods. Right?
Correct. That's what they're kind of saying.
Down, it's non-existent, and you need to rebuild brand new. And
right.
This is a very common practice of even how we feel about anti-racism, is it not? To break, we're not adding more law. It's, you need to break the system from the from the top down. This is not going to happen by a rebuild.
Yeah. So I think we can also replace ASHA with the DSM-5. The author was actually going after the DSM-5. That is the master's tools, right? And if we abide by the DSM-5 and the other ways, the medical model of the disability, which is what they were going for, that what they consider the master's tool, is that we can always question and challenge them, but it's never going to be dismantled until we physically move away from that. And that's where the neurodiversity movement kind of kicks in, is dismantling that idea.
So neurodiversity is dismantling. We're starting brand new, which is very accurate. And I'm just I'm really enjoying this conversation with you, by the way, because it's really kicking a lot of things into gear in my head. So it kind of goes along with, I am seeing that, right? Because since the neurodiversity movement, and I think what's very impactful personally is not, I don't really care about what the research says so much, right? I care most about the voices of autistic people, because they're telling me that this is how they're feeling and what they're seeing. I don't want to continue to perpetuate that, right? So I really do feel like the neurodiversity movement is not only is dismantling and rebuilding for me, because now, so just to go back to this article by Gaddy and Crow.
Yes.
Discussions of how should therapy intervention look like now, right? And it is dismantling that. And I do feel like these are valid, good ways to do therapy, just again, from a clinician's model of neuro-affirming evaluations and goals.
Yeah.
So one thing is providing dynamic assessments, right? Which, even if it wasn't neuro-affirming, dynamic assessments by standard is going to give us more information. by all, right? Like the findings that even bilingual families, like you need to do a dynamic assessment.
Yes, yes, yes.
There's so many different levels, and and this is found evidence that we're overqualifying so many students, especially children of color, of special education services. This has been going on for years, right? Like decades. And so doing dynamic assessment is the gold standard to me, at least, right? Like I need to do a language sample. And she talks about Leaders Project, Kate Crowley, Columbia University. Shout out to Columbia Teachers College. And doing the slam cards, right?
Yes, I love that. I love the slam cards. Yes.
The slam cards. And there's different like levels too. Like there's elementary school, middle, so it can be appropriate. Some things though, I found like I wish there was more.
Because it's limited. The slam cards are very limited. Right?
You only have a few choices. And then I'm like, well, what if you already took this before? And like, I don't know. So I wish there was I wish it was a little bit more, but that's fine. It's fine. It's great. Gives you a meta-analysis part of it as well. Theory of mind, there's perspective taking in there. There's also like your basic WH questions, but also part of the dynamic assessment, just for people who don't know what it is that like, even if I ask a question outside of their given analysis, that's still giving me information, right?
Right.
And even if, so I want to do a slam card every evaluation. So I just did one very recently. It is an 8-sequence picture card. And like, sure, my student cannot do all 8 pictures, but I do the first 4. Can you complete the next 4? And that's giving me findings, right?
Yeah.
That's saying that like you can't sequence 8, but you sure can sequence 4, or you can do it if I just give you some more verbal prompts. And this is part of that neurodiversity, neuro-affirming, because now I'm going to add to the accommodations that if you want to see the success of this student needs to have for everything needs to have visual supports, right? And that's how also they can stay in general education. They don't have to go all of a sudden now to, what they call like, what is it called, John? Like extensive high support needs classrooms. Basically like special day classrooms.
Basically special day class, yeah.
Right. And like really, being able to keep them staying in the gen ed classroom because they just need like visual supports is that a disability? Like, no, right? Like, it just means that you just need this as an accommodation. So
and everyone can benefit from it too. Yeah.
UDL, exactly. It's like, I could benefit from just having everything as a caption.
Yeah.
I'm not really like I'm just not a good listener. Like, so I don't know.
Oh my gosh.
I'm just not good at it. And some people are really good at also like writing notes. And I'm just like, dude, me writing IEP notes is ridiculous. Like I'm like trying to be verbatim about stuff. And I'm like, just synthesize the information. I'm like, I can't do it.
Are you writing a script? Teacher said, parents said, I said, administrator said, you're making a script.
It's so ridiculous. It's like, that's not what they needed. I'm like, I'm gonna process all the information because as I'm typing, you know how they keep talking? So like, you didn't even give me time to like think about what you really said. And now I can't even write it. So it's just like, I need closed captioning. I need to read what I'm doing. Like, actually this new generation, we're like kind of digressing, but like this new generation has like been found to use closed captioning anyway, right? The televisions are just like bad speakers and all of these benefit everyone. Also like text-to-speech benefits everyone, right? Apple iOS 17 just like launched like all these really cool features of accessibility for text-to-speech. So I'm seeing more and more inclusive designs there, but really I'm always hearing from able-bodied people giving me reviews about how they feel about the accessibility features. And I'm like, I'm glad that it's worked. And that's why we're getting more movement. Do you see what I'm saying?
I definitely see that.
Like it wasn't important that it's actually helping people who need it, but it's more important because now the majority likes it, right? So now it's becoming popular. But she talks about in this article, just to go back, like some ways in which you can be more neuro-affirming.
Yes, so that is the third point of the article here, is to really going back. I'm just going to summarize, define what neurodiversity is, how does neurodiversity fall into person-centered care and culturally responsive practices, and then what does that look like? How is it like, how would that look like in neurodiversity affirming practices? So I'm really interested in how they really mapped out really with these bullet points on page 6 for those who are following along with the article, right? That's where we're at, right, Sarah? Page 6.
I am at page 6, but also like LOL that you think people are actually reading this with us.
For those who are
like,
following along.
6. Actually, I'm not on page 6. I'm on page 9. Why are you?
Okay.
Okay,
Let's,
okay, go to page 6. Okay.
Yeah, let's go to page 6 when we're talking about the benefits of neurodiversity affirming services. And I do want to talk about one of these bullet points here. So, right, it says the service model include identifiable clinical attributes. So this is where we're really highlighting, mapping out what it looks like at a when we're implementing this, right? So the first bullet point says recognizing that autistic communities' differences, including styles of attending, listening, and engaging. We'll talk about that. We also have the rhetoric of listening, respecting multimodal forms of communication, right? Not imposing that communication hierarchy that one is better than the other, valuing client autonomy and agency, and respecting and teaching consent, such as physical touch, and then including clients in the creation of their goals. This is the part where kind of like, whoa, this can be a little bit of a controversy to the literature that the author is using to come to this conclusion. So, Sarah, I'm wondering if you have any questions about that, why I'm like dying on this hill.
Dying on what hill?
The idea of including the clients in the creation of their goals.
Well, again, because I do a lot of AAC, right? So I do, I think of AAC also because Janice Light and Buchelman in their textbook also kind of talks about this.
Yes.
I also think it goes along with Erna Allant idea of participation versus engagement and like all of that. And it, whenever possible, so they phrase it more as like whenever possible, you include them in the intervention plans and goals. And I think that it can be possible for some of the students that I have where I can discuss that with them, where I'm like, where I'm like asking them, like, do you feel like you want to be able to make friends? Like, do you, sometimes they're in home health, right? And I'm like,
right.
Well, what would you like? Like, do you need a group? Like, would that make you feel better? Like, how do you feel comfortable via Zoom, via in person? Like,
yeah,
you can have that. And I think that's considered, like, it's called strategy, right? Of like, if you're at the strategic competence level, then this is part of what you can have the capacity to do. But an area of which, like, I do feel like can be concerning is like, if you are younger, right? If you are little, and if you are not perhaps like, how can I say this? Like, there has been no consistent form of communication. And so if we don't even have a consistent access method for like, we're still at like, just making, like, I just want you to get through your day right now, just so that you can make requests or something like that. Like, if we're still at this kind of stage, it is more difficult to include them in that conversation, right? But I also feel like I can still talk about it with their families, and I still can talk about it with them as like, I don't know if they understand or not, but let's just competence, right? That's the whole idea of presuming competence.
Presuming competence, yeah.
That kind of look at it that way. Like, what were your thoughts on that?
So, Sarah, I really appreciate your perspective of really following ASHA's evidence-based practice and centering the goals as what the clients and families' values are, right? Now, I want to challenge you a little bit. There is a reason why I brought up using the master's tools will never destroy. I'm butchering Audre Lorde's poem, right? Using the master's tools. I want you to let's move away from that a little bit because this is what I'm going to challenge as a clinician. I want to introduce you to this article from Helker and Yergo on autism and rhetoric here. And one of the article that I have been exposed to in terms of the neurodiversity is one author that these author mentioned from Jim Crow. Jim Crow Jim Croter. Sorry. Jim Croter.
I was like, oh my God, is this from the Jim Crow law? Like, this is going to be so good. Like,
Sorry, Jim Croter. So Jim Croter used this definition of rhetoric. So listen to this, right? So Jim Croter defines rhetoric as a way of being in the world through language, through intervention, structure, style we encountered. And then that autism itself is a rhetoric. Autism is a way of being in the world through language, through invention, structure, and style. So according to Croter, every utterance belongs to, exists in, issues from, reveals in a rhetorical universe. Every utterance comes from somewhere, emerges as a structure, and manifests itself as a style. So if we follow this ideology, and did I say intervention before? According to Jim Croter, rhetoric here is a way of being in the world through invention, not intervention, structure, and style. And if autism is a rhetoric, it is a way of being in the world through language, through invention, structure, and style in its own way. So my question is, going back to Gaddy and Crow's idea of including clients in creation of their goals. Goals really mean we need to do something to get you to somewhere. If autism is their own way of being, then there's nothing to be treated. In that sense, there's no intervention required in that sense.
Time out. I need to reverse back for a second.
Yeah.
Jim Croter, part of the neurodiversity movement?
Jim Croter actually defined what rhetoric is. And the authors here, Paul Heilker and Melanie Yergo, kind of said if autism is itself its own way of being, right? Going back to the neurodiversity paradigm, saying that we're all different and that's okay.
Natural variation.
Correct. And if that is their own presence, that is their own identity, then why do we need that individual to be treated? Why do we need to have that goal?
That's a good question.
That's a really interesting question, isn't it? But I think, Sarah, this is where we can attempt to say being family-centered and being person-centered. What do you want to do in life? What is your personal goal? And how can
self-determination,
right? Self-determination, right? Instead of saying, John will produce subject, verb, object, sentences in 4 out of 5 opportunities. Why don't we just, again, we're working within our master's tools. Let's get away from the master's tools and we create our own goals. Say, John wants to have a job. John wants to get, to earn for a living. What kind of communication strategies can we help them to get to that goal? So that's one thing that I want to ask you about in terms of, in your clinical sense, is that goal writing in itself is a way of rejecting that person's current status, right? Current way of being. And if we're going back to Don't Mourn for Me by Jen Sinclair, those goals are rejecting who I am.
But does it have to be when you get what I'm saying, right?
Yeah,
when
exactly.
You are then asking the client, like,
what that
where
goal
do you
should
want
be.
to go? And
Exactly.
even if the client's, small children, like, even if you're neurotypical, like I have children, like they can't make their own goals, right? All right. So I have to kind of guide them as a parent, right? And so including like the family too, like where do you feel like where do you see your child going, right? That isn't, and I think that also goes back to the evaluation process as well.
Exactly. It goes back to the evaluation process. That also challenges the IDEA. Again, I consider that as a master's tool. It will never dismantle the special education oppressive nature, right? So things like that we should really think about. If we're really thinking neurodiversity is its own biological difference, do we really need to treat it? And if treatment is not necessary, then what should our role be as an SLP?
Oh, that was so powerful, John.
Hmm.
It's for all the people in the back to hear you, like for all the people back, like that was a really powerful statement. Yeah, like what, but I do, want to also say, to add to that, is that, I have met clients who, they're getting everything that they need. Like, also small children grow up, okay? Right? That's another thing. And I think we need to address that. Like, when you're small, like, sure, requesting, following visual schedules, like those things are things you might be able to work on, right? But I cannot force somebody to make comments, to want to engage in conversation, to want to like, I
Yes.
cannot force that, right? And at a certain
Yes.
point, they grow up, they become like 14, 16, 21, right? They can get whatever they're big. They know where things are and they will go get it themselves. Like, they don't want to engage in the conversation. Like, they don't want to do this. They don't want, and they show it, right? Like, we need to, oh yeah, it goes back to this article by Gaddy and Crow where they talk about this as well, where they're saying, hey, like, there's other forms of communication, right? And we see that in a lot of our clients, that when they're visibly not wanting to do the work, right? Like pushing things away, refusing to move out of the room or their seat, right? It's like they're visibly telling me that this is not what they want. And yes, speech has not come along, or like, yes, they don't have like a very solid form of communication just yet, right? But maybe that is where they're happy. Why can't we accept their joy?
That goes back to that's a really great question, because I think not a lot of people or even clinicians are ready to accept that. Not a lot of clinicians and families are ready to accept that type of presence, right? Because they think, how will they be independently living when they get older?
Yeah. And
how is this functional?
That conversation comes up all the time. Like, anytime I bring this up, that conversation comes, right? And I'm just like, first, no, really. I mean, before the neurodiversity movement, like, we all as clinicians have students who are like 16. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that they don't want to comment. Like, I'm pretty sure they don't have questions to ask right now, right? And it's like, is it a matter that we don't think that they know, or is it a matter of like they don't want to do it? Like that, so before even the neurodiversity movement, like, there is a question of like, is this ethical? Because we're forcing them to do things, and I don't feel good when I'm doing that, right? Like,
yeah,
I look at speech therapy as it should be a fun time. It shouldn't be a compliance time. Like, it is very radically different, I think, from the classroom, okay? Because I don't assign homework. I don't, anyway, so just a separate thing. But basically, that conversation comes up all the time. We're like, well, they're not independent. They're not going to be functional, the blah, blah. And I'm just like, you know what? Let me introduce you to a new book too. It's by Alice Wong. It's called The Year of the Tiger, right? And it's her own like kind of memoir.
Yeah, that's right.
A memoir either, because she like is a writer, and so she has written a lot of articles and pieces, and she kind of compiled it together, right? Chinese American, I believe, but Asian American for sure, and lives in San Francisco, right? Okay, so she even said in that book, like, why is it not independent if I can tell a caretaker what to do for me? And I'm like, that was a valid point. She's like, I am, or like, she has a her muscle atrophy, right? So she's
that's
like,
right.
Right. And so she's like, they're forcing me to keep walking for as long as I can, but it's like painful, because the ideal of being like mobile by like leg movement is more valuable than wheelchair.
Yeah.
She like says these really piercing things, right? And I'm like, that is absolutely true. Where like, even if you need a caretaker in the future, why is that even bad? Why is independence so important in the ways of being able to move around the community? Like, why can't it be independent enough just to be like, I go to the bathroom when I need to, or
Right.
I eat
Right.
with my hands. Like, I'm not
Hmm.
waiting for stuff. Or even if you couldn't eat with your hands, like, hypothetically, let's say like you can tell somebody I'm hungry. Why is that not independent? Like, you
Mm,
need to kind of question what independence is. And
hmm.
on top of it, it's like, what when we want independence, it's so much to the point that I kind of feel like, why, when we have all these services are very available for this purpose? Does that does that make sense? So like you have like adult care, right? And that is for the purposes for the people who need it. So if they need it and they have it, like, I question why we keep forcing them to live without it.
So that's a great question. I honestly think if in a hypothetical world where everybody is living with their moral and ethical standards high, then yes, we should be definitely taking those services. But we've heard so many things where caregivers were abusing, are abusing the elderly. Caregivers are abusing adults who cannot consent verbally, and those things really like if you had a child who cannot speak and communicate with you, and that child grows up, lives in a care facility, and that adult child now is getting, I don't know, abused sexually, physically, mentally, but
Yes.
does not know, like parents has no idea. I think that's another thing too, is like how can these kids fend for themselves when they're in a very cruel world?
I understand. So it sounds like we should create goals for self advocacy. Do you know what I mean? Like, is that not where we're going?
So I think this is where the clear distinction where theory and practice is like not in alignment. So in theory, everything we talked about was in theory, right? So yes, autism is its own rhetoric, it's its own invention, its own language. So there's no need to be treated. You're absolutely right. And neurodiversity movement, we talked about that everybody is different in their own way, biologically, neurologically, and that's okay. And we also talked about how I think is it Tim Walker, I think the author from Neuro Queer Heresies is talking about the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Is that if we follow the pattern of how we do things clinically here, it will never challenge how we think about neurodiversity and autism. And this is where now we're going into practice, and practice is telling us something a little bit that's different. Because how are these kids going to fend for themselves if we don't give them the tool to consent, to communicate their wants and needs, and to be an independent, thriving community members, right? If we go, I mean, this is something that I'm learning in my doctoral program is like if you go back to the purpose of schooling back in our country in the US, it was basically taught for nation building. So if you're a child and if your dad is the blacksmith, then you'll learn how to blacksmith. If you're a child of a family that does farming, then you'll learn how to farm and eventually contribute to the society and build the nation. Now education has shifted, but if we go back to education, is how can this individual be contributing to the society? I think that is where practice gets a little misaligned with the theory here. So I want to hear from, like, I mean, we are both clinicians, we're both practitioners, but now how does that translate into practice? Let's really think about that type of conversation.
Well, okay. Also, to add to that, I do want to say that, like, a lot of times when I'm like in these kind of spaces and I have to make these decisions,
Yeah, yeah.
when I'm like, so it's a possible exit of services if you're a school-based SLP, right? I am also super reflective where I feel bad too. Okay. Where I'm like, I don't want this to be something like, because I want one less person off my caseload. You know what I mean? Like,
I mean, I'm sure we have SLPs listening to our podcast, but just to give context for those who are not SLPs, I mean, school-based SLPs nowadays have really high caseload. And if you're specialized in a particular area, such as augmentative and alternative communication, you have more. So before joining to my PhD program, I had a caseload of about 80 kids
wow.
as an itinerant. So I go around the entire school district doing AAC assessments and evaluation. And I'm sure it's similar to what you're doing, right, as a
Yeah.
clinician.
So you could have anywhere from like 60 to 80 students on
Hmm.
caseload, right? Because
Right,
there's no
right,
caseload cap, right? And
right.
so, but I guess like, I mean, and sometimes you do have a caseload cap, and the caseload cap is actually 80. Like it's like
It's
still a
an 80.
ridiculous,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's still
It's
like a
80.
ridiculous number. It's not like 25, you know?
Yeah. So how can
So,
one person support 80 kids with
yeah, it's
all
like
these diverse
very,
needs?
yeah, and
Yeah.
that's like another problem in it, like the capacity building, right? It's anyway, but I guess like one thing that I do worry about is because my caseload is so high, am I just feeling like, I wonder if I just am like being like, I just want one less person off of my caseload. Like, is that a burden to me? And is that why I'm reacting this way? Like, I have to be self-reflective about those area, like about that, because I think that is very true too, where like you're looking at your caseload and you're just like, this is still moving. There's still progress here for this. You know, we've been on the same place for so long. So like, there's
Hmm.
nothing more I can give. So let's just like exit out. Right. And I think there is like a sentiment to that. Um, but at the same time, like I think from a clinical perspective, I think, you know, I have to, if the families feel like we need to keep them on to work on whatever, I feel like I do that. And I'm not argumentative is my thinking, but I do feel like, yeah, like it is, what you're bringing up here is an interesting point about like our clients will be very vulnerable, more so than other able-bodied people, right? And if
Exactly.
you add
Exactly.
non-speaking to that,
Hmm.
that's a very
Hmm.
vulnerable space to be.
So that's another thing. I mean, I think that's just the reality. And I think sometimes reading theory is good, but we may need to connect it to, well, what does this look like? When families have certain expectation and when the world is currently in this situation, what should we do as clinicians here? So I think that's where the clinical dilemma comes in as a clinician. And like, I don't know about, there's kids who are nonverbal, right? Autistic individuals who are nonverbal. We tried everything, right? And then they just don't progress, right? We call it plateauing, right? They make progress and then they just stop and they just continue on. And this is gonna be like going on for like years and every 3 year we do a triennial. It's like this is exactly where we're at. So for me, I'm really thinking like, what do we do at this point?
When you're seeing plateauing.
Yeah, when you see plateau, no progress, do we
Well, I also question the goals itself. When we say plateau, we're like talking about like how many goals? Like, do you know what I mean?
mm,
Like
hmm,
what? And also
hmm.
makes me question. I feel like we don't question enough about what's working. Instead, we keep shifting the blame. Like, do you do you feel that way? Like
Exactly, exactly,
we shift
exactly.
blame. We're like,
Yeah.
well, it's
Mhm.
because the gen ed teacher or like the special ed teacher didn't, and like, oh, the families are not, and da 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 da. And I'm just like, okay, like those are all different variables there that you just put up. But then why don't we question by like changing some of that then, And like,
Yeah.
I just can't, I don't feel comfortable just being like, they've plateaued, there's nothing else to work on. Also, if I
Mhm.
haven't weighed out those different variables too, right? Like, what if we change this? What if I look at this instead of communication of request, for example, right? Which, that's another thing, requesting. That's
we have to do another talk on that. Yeah, on
yeah, right.
requesting.
But I'm like, requesting isn't the be all end all, right? Like it also sometimes isn't the first stop too for some clients, right? Like they're much more in because they get their own stuff. That's why. You know what I mean? They walk over, they're tall enough, right? And so I guess like I also wonder like, what are the types of goals that we're writing and how can we change that? How can we be systematic about that? And how do we make it something that the clients care about? I think, and Janice Light and Buchelman also says this a lot, where it's like it needs to be a highly motivating activity. Like they want to do those things because it's just not going to work if they don't care about it.
Exactly. And I think we are always we're always missing that when we're writing goals, right? John will produce subject, verb, object sentences. We're like, what if I don't want to produce that?
They
right?
actually just don't have anything to say. I was just talking about that to somebody. I got a goal that was like, you will speak in 5 words plus sentences. And I was like, what does it matter how many counts I do? Like the question is like, like maybe he doesn't want to talk so much about that. Like he doesn't want to talk. Okay. Like he answered my questions in 3 to 4 words.
So I do want to bring this back to continuing the conversation on rhetoric here is listening and silence. The author talks about listening and silence, right? And the author mentions Krista Radcliffe, rhetorical listening. It's a practice that urges us to fundamentally alter how we hear and respond to the discourse of others. So here, right? Let's consider the silence. What does that silence really mean? Is that silence just maybe that person doesn't want to talk exactly what you said? Or is that silence mean like I do not want to engage with you? I'm upset with you. Maybe there is a deeper social context as to why this individual does not want to talk to you. Instead of saying, well, this kid doesn't talk, we got to push him to talk. Well, maybe I don't want to talk to you. Maybe you offended me on my very first day of speech. Things we may not even know that we could have offended them from their very first day. So, in the article Autism as Rhetoric, they say like rhetorical listening does not presume a naive relativistic empathy such as I'm okay, you're okay, but rather an ethical responsibility to argue for what is we deem fair and just while questioning that which we deem fair and just.
John, auditory is not my forte. So can you please re-summarize that one more time?
Yes. So rhetorical listening allows us to generate a more productive discourse about autism and the rhetorical triangle. And we're not going to get into the rhetorical triangle here. Is that rhetorical listening does not presume a naive relativistic empathy, such as I'm okay, you're okay, but rather an ethical responsibility to argue for what we deem fair and just while we question that while questioning that which we deem fair and just. So, for example, you have a child who's nonverbal, right? Doesn't want to talk to you. Instead of saying, maybe he doesn't have language, maybe he doesn't have that, we can say, why don't we look at a bigger context of why this person is not engaging with you? Maybe this person is interested in something else. Maybe this person is not feeling your vibe. Yeah. We always have to fight the instances of maybe this person is nonverbal because they're nonverbal, right?
Yes.
And we also need to question, like, why is he doing that? Is he annoyed by something? Is he annoyed by their neighbor who's sitting next to them in class? There's something going on.
I feel like we don't do this enough for autistic children. We don't engage with them enough, right? Because we feel like their type of play is, they call it repetitive, right? Like looking at the car wheels and spinning it, you know what I mean? Like something like that. We were like, that's odd way of playing. Like, don't play like that, And I think that really, that's how
that's true. That is so true.
People do, right?
Yeah,
or like,
yeah.
they do repetitive, they call it repetitive movements, right? But I think as part of this neurodiversity movement too, is that like we don't want to look at that as odd, or we don't want to look at that and call that like repetitive behavior, but maybe we could just still consider that as play. And maybe
Mm.
you can also like try to engage in that with them. And I think Hannon, I believe it's the Hannon, right? The
It takes two to talk.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Hannon kind of like talks about that too, that like if you really want to see communication, you first need to go through engagement, right? And then like how can you get there is by like connecting with your client. So that might be playing in that similar way too, right?
Hmm.
Like engage with them. I'm often seeing more times than not, people are taking away, with you take something away and you're like kind of withholding,
And then
right?
you center requesting.
Yes. And then you do like discrete trial.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And like, that doesn't seem very ethical and appropriate too, right? And so, I mean, I think we need to be careful because I don't like blanket statements either, right? Like, I do feel like, does that work for some? I don't know, right? Like,
So
it be highly
let's,
effective though? Like, you know what I'm saying? So I don't want to go into it, but
but
what I
yeah,
want to get into
yeah,
is
yeah,
the
yeah,
fact of
yeah.
like, I don't know if we do enough engagement with clients directly in what they're interested in because we assume that that behavior is not societally appropriate and it falls in line
And
with,
something that we need to fix
yeah,
with goals. Yeah, or like the child will initiate greetings. You
yes,
know what that type of thing.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So things like that. So yeah, I think we're at a good time to wrap up the conversation. What do you think, Sarah? Is there anything that you'd like to contribute or?
I think I don't have anything to contribute, but I do still have
Mhm.
questions
Okay.
of like where do we where is this only for autistic, like is this for only the autistic clients, or is this going to be, because she does define here that it's for everyone, that it's for like ADHD, dyslexia, like neurodiversity
That's
across
right.
all the different
That's right.
domains here.
Yeah.
And I'm just feeling like, oh, like is this including ID, like so I do feel like I would like to hear from the voices of these other groups of people as well,
Yes, exactly.
from autistic
Hmm.
individuals, right? Because
Hmm.
this neurodiversity movement is it question mark, is it rather, right? Up until this point, I've only heard about neurodiversity from the perspective of autistic individuals. So I would like to hear more from the other disabilities so that it could also shape our understanding of neurodiversity. And to your point, John, I think once that happens, it can also change the way that we'll be doing intervention.
Yes, yes. So I think that's a really great question. The term neurodiversity really goes back to the saying that we're all different in our own ways, and that's okay. And most of the conversation has been with autistic individuals. But I think the new way to venture in is to look at the disability at large, right? Because if we think about it timeline wise, I feel like the neurodiversity movement and the disability rights movement somewhat overlapped in terms of the publications of their works, right? And and I think neurodiversity emerged from the autism community, but is it also going into other bigger disability communities? Maybe that's something that we have to observe, but it would be nice to have other disability community members saying, do I consider myself neurodivergent,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then in terms of intervention, going back to that phrase, a master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Instead of treating them, why don't we empower? Treatment to empowering,
Yeah.
right? Instead of writing goals about this child will initiate, what if the child, will do something that they enjoy? And how can the child ask for access, ask for accommodation? Um, Maybe it's an abstract thought still at this point, but how can you move from treating to empowering? I think that's another concept there. Is because according to all these theories that we read, autism is something that we should treat, that we should not treat. I'm sorry, that we should not treat. So what is the role of the SLP?
Good questions all around, John.
Mhm. All right, so I think that wraps up this article. Overall, if you are interested in this article, it is available in the American Speech Language Hearing Association in one of their ASHA journals as well, and we are also welcome to provide that in our description of the podcast. So, and also please feel free to reach out if you would like a copy of this article.
Yes, thank you so much. And we're looking forward to hearing from everyone and looking forward to the next episode, John.
Sounds great.
For the research.
For the research, let's definitely do that. All right. Have a good one. Bye.